Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Seraphina Vale Hale woke before dawn because silence felt safer than daylight. The Manhattan penthouse was still wrapped in blue-gray shadows, the skyline beyond the glass walls blinking slowly as if the city itself was stretching awake. 30 floors below, traffic would soon begin humming, but up here, there was only the faint whir of climate control and the soft rhythm of Dominic's breathing behind her. She stood barefoot at the window, hands loosely folded, watching the river cut through steel and concrete. This view had once made her feel invincible. Now it felt like a stage set, beautiful, expensive, and strangely hollow. Dominic Hale was everything the world admired. Founder and CEO of Hale Infrastructure Group, he built sustainable commercial towers that redefined skylines. Investors trusted him. Mayors praised him. Magazines photographed him beneath captions that called him visionary. At galas, he commanded attention without raising his voice. He had the rare ability to make powerful people feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Seraphina had once loved that about him. She believed she had married not just ambition, but integrity. She had her own ambitions once. Before the penthouse, before the foundation dinners and donor luncheons, Seraphina curated contemporary art exhibits. She understood space, texture, emotional narrative. She believed art could challenge perception the way architecture reshaped cities. But marriage had shifted her focus. Dominic's schedule was relentless. His ascent required a polished domestic image, and Seraphina stepped into the role effortlessly. She organized charity auctions, refined guest lists, memorized investor spouses' preferences. She convinced herself that partnership meant reallocation of dreams, not abandonment. Friends described them as stable. Her sister Eloane once joked that they were too calm to be real. Their dinner parties were immaculate, curated wine pairings, strategic seating charts, conversations that glided across politics and philanthropy without ever bruising egos. Seraphina learned how to read a room the way Dominic read balance sheets. Together, they were seamless. But seamless did not mean intimate. Dominic began returning home later. At first, it was plausible: expansion projects, zoning negotiations, international investors. He spoke in numbers and timelines, exhaustion shadowing his jawline. Seraphina responded with quiet efficiency: meals reheated at precise temperatures, tailored suits arranged for early meetings. She didn't question him. She trusted the rhythm of their marriage the way she once trusted the rhythm of installing an exhibit. If something felt slightly off, she adjusted lighting, never the structure. Then a new name began to circulate in Dominic's sentences: Vivienne Lauron. "She's exceptional with media optics," he would say while loosening his tie. "She has remarkable instincts. She understands branding." Vivienne had joined as a strategic communications consultant during a high-profile municipal contract negotiation. According to Dominic, she was sharp, discreet, invaluable. Seraphina listened, nodded, asked polite questions. She noticed how Dominic's voice sharpened when he spoke her name, not with romance, not yet, but with stimulation. A mind meeting another mind. Seraphina met Vivienne at a private investor cocktail evening held at the penthouse. Vivienne arrived in understated silk, her posture straight, expression poised but not eager. She did not flirt. She did not overperform. She observed. Her smile was economical. When she and Seraphina shook hands, Vivienne's grip was neither submissive nor competitive. It was measured. "You've built something remarkable together," Vivienne said, glancing briefly toward Dominic across the room. "It shows." The comment was perfectly phrased. Inclusive. Respectful. Harmless. Seraphina felt nothing alarming, only a faint shift in atmospheric pressure she couldn't yet name. Weeks passed. Dominic's phone buzzed more frequently at dinner. He began stepping onto the balcony to take calls. Once, as he moved away, Seraphina noticed the change in his tone, lighter, almost amused. When he returned, he offered a summary too quickly, as if rehearsed. "Media contingency planning," he said. "Nothing dramatic." Seraphina did not search his phone. She did not interrogate him. She believed trust was an investment. If she started auditing it, she would destabilize the foundation. Instead, she buried herself in planning the Hale Foundation's annual Winter Gala. It would be the largest event of the year, drawing politicians, philanthropists, international press. The theme centered on urban sustainability and public art, a merging of Dominic's industry and her original passion. For the first time in years, she felt creative control again. She personally selected installations. She negotiated with sculptors. She arranged lighting schematics that would transform the ballroom into an immersive environment. Dominic praised her work. "You're extraordinary at this," he said one night, kissing her forehead absent-mindedly while scanning emails. "I couldn't do it without you." The words should have warmed her. Instead, they felt procedural. Julian Cross noticed first. Julian had known Seraphina since graduate school. He went into behavioral psychiatry while she pursued curatorial design. He visited the penthouse one evening for wine, his perceptive gaze missing nothing. After Dominic excused himself for yet another call, Julian leaned back in his chair. "You're compensating," he said quietly. "For what?" Seraphina asked. "For something you don't want to look at." She dismissed him with a controlled smile. Julian had always believed human behavior could be mapped like circuitry. She refused to reduce her marriage to data patterns. Still, that night she lay awake longer than usual. The Winter Gala approached like a rising tide. Dominic was increasingly preoccupied. Meetings extended late into the night. Vivienne's name threaded through nearly every logistical update. "She'll handle press coordination. She's aligning the sponsorship messaging. She's invaluable." On the afternoon of the gala, Seraphina stood in the empty ballroom overseeing final arrangements. Sculptures cast elongated shadows against textured walls. Crystal glassware caught the light like constellations. She felt composed, in control. This was her territory. Vivienne arrived early to review media placements. She wore black velvet, minimal jewelry, her expression calm. The two women moved through the space professionally, discussing photographer angles and guest flow. There was no tension in their words, only in the silence between them. "You're very composed," Vivienne observed at one point. "I prefer clarity," Seraphina replied. Vivienne's smile deepened slightly, as though she appreciated the answer too much. Guests filled the ballroom by 8. Flashbulbs flared. Music swelled. Dominic entered with effortless confidence, one hand resting at Seraphina's waist. They posed. They laughed. They performed unity so convincingly that even Seraphina almost believed it. Midway through the evening, Dominic drifted away for what he claimed was a brief sponsor conversation. Seraphina watched him from across the room while speaking with donors. She saw Vivienne approach him near a marble column. They leaned in slightly to hear each other over the music. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obvious. Until it happened. Vivienne said something Seraphina couldn't hear. Dominic laughed, a rare, unguarded sound. And then, in a moment that was too fluid to be accidental yet too brief to be theatrical, he kissed her. Not on the cheek. On the mouth. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't hidden. It was deliberate. The room did not erupt. No one screamed. A few nearby guests froze. Others pretended not to notice. The music continued. Seraphina felt the impact not as pain, but as clarity. Her pulse did not spike. Her breath did not falter. Something inside her simply aligned into stillness. She walked toward them. Dominic pulled away from Vivienne too late, his expression flickering between surprise and calculation. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to minimize. Seraphina smiled. Not a brittle smile. Not a trembling one. A calm, immaculate smile. She adjusted Dominic's cufflink gently, as if correcting a minor wardrobe error. "Enjoy the evening," she said softly. And then she turned back toward the guests, resuming conversations with impeccable composure while whispers began threading through the ballroom like invisible smoke. Dominic would later realize that her smile was not forgiveness. It was departure. But that realization would not come tonight. Tonight, Seraphina moved through the remainder of the gala like a woman who had finally stopped waiting for something to change. Because it already had. Seraphina did not leave the gala immediately after the kiss. Walking out would have created spectacle, and spectacle was emotional currency she refused to spend. Instead, she continued greeting donors, thanking sponsors, and guiding conversations with the same measured warmth that had defined her public life for years. Only someone studying her pulse might have noticed the difference, the sudden absence of emotional fluctuation. Inside her, something had gone unnervingly quiet, like a theater after the final curtain falls. Across the ballroom, Dominic attempted to recover control. He moved quickly into conversations, laughter slightly louder than usual, gestures sharper, as though charisma alone could erase what had just happened. Vivienne, meanwhile, displayed a mastery of social survival that almost impressed Seraphina. She neither fled nor clung to Dominic. Instead, she engaged with guests, discussing philanthropic branding with professional ease. To anyone unaware of the moment, she appeared exactly what she was hired to be, indispensable. Julian appeared beside Seraphina near the sculpture installation, his gaze moving once from Dominic to Vivienne and back again. He did not ask what happened. He simply said, very quietly, "Your breathing changed." Seraphina lifted her champagne glass but did not drink. So did the temperature in the room. Julian studied her face longer than politeness allowed. Shock usually fractures people. You look organized. I am, she replied. The gala ended past midnight. When the final guests departed and the staff began dismantling the installations, Dominic approached her with cautious urgency. "Seraphina, we need to talk." "Not here," she answered calmly. The drive home unfolded in silence thick enough to feel upholstered. City lights streaked across the tinted windows while Dominic rehearsed explanations he wasn't yet brave enough to deliver. Inside the penthouse, he finally spoke. It was a mistake. Seraphina slipped off her heels, aligning them neatly beside the console. Mistakes are accidental. That wasn't. He ran a hand through his hair. It didn't mean anything. That, she said, turning toward him for the first time, is somehow worse. Dominic stepped closer, lowering his voice into the persuasive register that had secured billion-dollar deals. We've both been under pressure. The company is expanding. Vivienne and I work closely. Proximity creates distortions. Seraphina watched him as one might watch a stranger explain weather patterns. No anger rose in her chest. Only understanding, cold and precise. I'm tired, she said. We'll discuss logistics tomorrow. The word logistics unsettled him far more than accusations would have. Morning arrived with brutal normalcy. Sunlight flooded the kitchen, glinting off marble counters while the espresso machine hummed. Seraphina prepared coffee exactly as she always had. Dominic entered cautiously, as though approaching a fragile structure. "You're making breakfast?" he asked. "I'm maintaining routine," she replied. He interpreted her calm as negotiable terrain. "Last night doesn't have to define us." Seraphina placed his cup before him. "It already does." He tried again. "We can go away. Reset." She met his eyes then, not with fury, but with a stillness that made him feel suddenly transparent. "I don't reset betrayals, Dominic. I outgrow them." He felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his ribs, fear. Yet when she left the apartment an hour later dressed in a tailored ivory coat, he convinced himself she simply needed space. He did not follow her. Had he done so, he would have watched her step into the offices of Theodore Caldwell. Theodore Caldwell's office overlooked a quieter stretch of the city, far from the glass aggression of Dominic's towers. Books lined the walls, case law, financial strategy, psychological negotiation. Caldwell himself rose slowly as she entered, his silver hair catching the morning light. "How may I help you, Mrs. Hale?" Seraphina sat without fidgeting. "I want a divorce executed with precision." He did not react with surprise. Men in Dominic's orbit often underestimated the observational capacity of the women beside them. "Do you want retaliation?" Caldwell asked gently. "Or liberation?" "Liberation," she said. But I won't subsidize his disloyalty. A faint smile touched the attorney's mouth. Good. Clarity shortens wars. For the next hour, they mapped strategy, documentation, asset tracing, timeline establishment, emotional neutrality. Caldwell emphasized patience above all else. Silence is frequently mistaken for weakness, he told her. Use that. When Seraphina stepped back onto the street, the winter air felt sharper, but breathable. For the first time in years, her life was no longer orbiting Dominic's gravity. Days passed. Dominic attempted restoration through charm, sending rare orchids, cancelling evening meetings, suggesting dinners at the restaurants where their early courtship had unfolded. Seraphina declined without hostility. Meanwhile, she began assembling her independence with almost architectural care. She reopened communication with the Whitmore Gallery Collective, a prestigious curatorial network she had once declined to join after marriage. Its director, Matthias Corvin, remembered her work vividly. You vanished at the height of your creative momentum, he told her during their meeting inside the gallery's echoing white halls. I redirected, she corrected. Matthias regarded her thoughtfully. Redirection implies choice. Your eyes suggest postponement. She surprised herself by smiling. They walked among large-scale installations while discussing an upcoming international exhibition. Matthias spoke to her as an equal, not as Dominic Hale's wife, but as Seraphina Vale, curator. It felt like oxygen. Dominic, however, was beginning to notice structural changes at home. She no longer asked about his schedule, no longer waited for dinner, no longer softened rooms with her presence. One evening he found her reviewing financial documents at the dining table. Since when do you care about corporate filings? He asked lightly. Since I realized I should have always cared. He laughed, uneasy. You're acting like you're preparing for something. She met his gaze with serene honesty. I am. The answer lingered in the air long after she closed the folder. Vivienne did not retreat from Dominic's life. If anything, the scandal seemed only to sharpen her composure. At the office, she maintained professional boundaries so flawlessly that rumors struggled to root themselves. Yet subtle shifts were visible: longer strategy sessions, private consultations, shared arrivals at industry events. Cassandra Rourke, Dominic's strategic director, observed everything. You've grown careless, she told him one evening after a board meeting. I haven't, he snapped. You kissed a colleague at a public gala. Dominic exhaled sharply. It's contained. Nothing is contained, Cassandra replied. Reputation collapses quietly before it falls loudly. He dismissed her warning, but not convincingly. Seraphina's sister Eloane visited unexpectedly one afternoon, carrying pastries and concern. You look taller, Eloane said after studying her. I stopped shrinking, Seraphina answered. When Eloane learned what happened, fury ignited instantly. I'll confront him. No, Seraphina said calmly. Noise dilutes strategy. Eloane stared. You're terrifying. Not terrifying, Seraphina replied. Resolved. Weeks after the gala, Dominic arrived home early with an unfamiliar urgency. He found Seraphina in the living room reviewing travel catalogues. Planning a trip? He asked. Yes. With me? No. The word struck harder than any accusation. Seraphina. Are you leaving? She tilted her head slightly. I left the moment you chose someone else while I was still standing in the room. He reached for her then, but she stepped back, not dramatically, simply decisively. Something in his chest finally fractured. The morning the papers were served was almost aggressively ordinary. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Coffee steamed between them. Dominic scanned market updates while Seraphina watched the city wake. The doorbell rang. She rose, accepted the envelope from the courier, and returned to the table. Dominic frowned. What's that? She placed it before him with steady hands. Read it. The silence that followed seemed to expand until even the rain paused to listen. His eyes moved across the first page. Then again, slower. Divorce petition. Filed. Structured. Irrevocable. He looked up, color draining from his face. You're serious? Seraphina held his gaze, calm, unshaking. I smiled that night because I understood something, she said softly. Loyalty cannot be negotiated, and love should never require self-erasure. Panic flickered across his expression. We can fix this. She shook her head once. It is already fixed. I chose myself. For the first time since building his empire, Dominic Hale realized he had miscalculated something fundamental. Not markets. Not investors. His wife. And as Seraphina stepped past him, sunlight breaking through the storm clouds, the future opened before her, vast, unscripted, and entirely her own. The news did not detonate immediately. Dominic had spent his entire career mastering damage control. An instinct drove him into containment mode the moment the courier's footsteps faded down the hallway. By noon, his legal team was already calling Caldwell's office, probing for weaknesses, requesting private arbitration, suggesting discretion. Dominic convinced himself this was still a negotiation. Marriages among powerful people fractured all the time and were quietly reassembled behind polished doors. What unsettled him was not the filing itself, but the composure with which Seraphina moved through the apartment afterward, gathering only what she needed for the day, as though nothing seismic had occurred. He followed her into the foyer. Tell me what you want, he said, voice low, controlled. We don't have to destroy everything. Seraphina fastened the clasp of her watch. Everything was destroyed the moment respect left the room. That was one moment, he insisted. No, she replied gently. It was the moment that revealed all the others you hoped I wouldn't see. Dominic stepped closer. Is there someone advising you? Julian? Your sister? Yes, she said. Clarity is advising me. The elevator doors closed between them before he could respond, leaving him staring at his reflection, immaculate suit, perfect posture, and for the first time, unmistakable instability behind the eyes. Within 48 hours, controlled whispers began threading through their social circle. No official statement had been released, yet absence was louder than confirmation. Seraphina declined 2 charity invitations she would normally headline. Dominic attended a development summit alone. Observant guests noticed. The ecosystem of influence thrived on patterns, and their pattern had broken. Cassandra requested a private meeting that afternoon. You need to prepare for narrative exposure, she said, placing a tablet before him displaying speculative industry chatter. This is premature, Dominic replied. It is predictive, she corrected. If this becomes public, investors will question judgment, not morality, judgment. They entrust you with long-term infrastructure. Stability is the currency. He leaned back slowly. Are you suggesting my marriage impacts shareholder confidence? I'm suggesting optics always precede numbers. Dominic rubbed his temple. Vivienne had nothing to do with the filing. Cassandra's gaze sharpened. Then ensure she has nothing to do with the fallout. Vivienne, meanwhile, had already sensed the shift. She entered Dominic's office that evening without hesitation, closing the door behind her. Is it true? She asked. Yes. She studied him carefully, not with panic, but with evaluation. Do you want this divorce? I want control, he said. Vivienne moved toward the window overlooking the city Dominic had helped reshape. Control is often the first illusion to collapse. He turned toward her. Are you worried about your position? I'm worried about turbulence, she replied. Turbulence doesn't discriminate. For the first time since the gala, Dominic noticed something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Vivienne was not a refuge. She was an accelerant. Seraphina did not return to the penthouse that night. Instead, she stepped into a residence she had quietly secured weeks earlier. A high-ceilinged apartment overlooking a tree-lined avenue where the city felt less like a performance and more like a place people actually lived. No towering glass. No architectural intimidation. Warm light pooled across hardwood floors. The rooms were intentionally sparse, waiting to be shaped. Eloan arrived within the hour carrying groceries and an expression hovering between heartbreak and pride. You really did it, she whispered. Seraphina set her coat aside. I chose peace before permission. They unpacked dishes together, the domestic simplicity grounding in a way the penthouse never had been. Later, sitting cross-legged on the floor eating takeout, Eloane studied her carefully. Are you going to break down? She asked. No, Seraphina said after a moment. Breaking implies damage. I feel clarified. Eloane exhaled slowly. He underestimated you. Seraphina allowed herself the faintest smile. So did I. The following week, Seraphina walked through the Whitmore Gallery Collective again, this time not as a visitor but as the newly appointed lead curator for an international exhibition titled Structures of Memory. The irony did not escape her, an exhibit exploring how environments shape emotional permanence. Matthias Corvin joined her beside a massive steel installation suspended mid-air. You're different already, he observed. I removed noise, she said. He nodded approvingly. Creation requires silence. As they discussed artist placements, lighting temperatures, and narrative flow, Seraphina felt her mind reawakening, not tentatively, but with startling force. Decisions came quickly. Vision sharpened. For years she had been operating at a fraction of her intellectual range, and now it surged back like circulation returning to a numbed limb. Matthias watched her with professional admiration. Some people rebuild after collapse, he said. You appear to be expanding. Dominic attempted contact repeatedly, messages ranging from logistical to almost vulnerable. We should discuss the house. Investors asking questions. I miss talking to you. She responded only through attorneys. The absence of her voice became louder than confrontation. One evening, unable to tolerate the silence, Dominic drove past a new building. He did not exit the car. He simply watched the lit windows, realizing he did not know which one was hers, and that the ignorance symbolized something far greater. For the first time in decades, Dominic Hale felt locked out of a structure he had not realized he depended upon. Pressure intensified at the firm. A municipal contract entered review unexpectedly. Analysts began probing leadership resilience. Though no scandal had officially broken, uncertainty alone caused microscopic tremors, the kind Cassandra understood could widen into fractures if ignored. You need a public anchor, she advised. Appear steady. Visible. Dominic agreed to attend the Lanchester Economic Forum, an elite gathering where perception often rewrote reality. Vivienne accompanied him. Their entrance drew attention, not overt, but perceptible. Conversations paused a fraction too long. Introductions carried subtle curiosity. Dominic spoke on a panel about sustainable urban futures, delivering insights with his usual authority, yet beneath the fluency lay a strain only the highly perceptive could detect. Afterward, as applause faded, a journalist asked lightly, "Will Mrs. Hale be joining you at the innovation banquet tomorrow?" Dominic's smile did not falter. Seraphina is pursuing independent projects this season, he replied. It was technically true. It also sounded like distance. Seraphina spent that same evening in the gallery after hours, adjusting spotlights herself while music drifted softly through the empty halls. Julian arrived carrying 2 coffees, setting one beside her without interrupting her concentration. You look alive, he said. I feel accurate, she replied. He studied her quietly. Most people seek revenge. Revenge binds you to the injury, she said. I prefer release. Julian considered that, then asked the question he had been holding back. Did you ever stop loving him before the gala? Seraphina adjusted the light once more before answering. No, but I stopped loving the version of myself that accepted less than I deserved. Julian smiled faintly. That is a far rarer transformation. Dominic finally saw her again 3 weeks later, not in private, but across a crowded hall at the Calder Foundation benefit. Neither had known the other would attend. For a suspended second, the room seemed to tilt. Seraphina wore deep emerald, the color amplifying the steadiness in her gaze. She was speaking with patrons, her posture relaxed, laughter unforced. There was no visible scar from their separation. Dominic approached slowly. You look well, he said. I am well. The simplicity disarmed him. I never imagined we would become strangers. We didn't, she replied. We became truthful. He hesitated, then asked quietly, was there nothing left worth saving? Seraphina held his eyes. Not cold, not warm, simply final. Mutual respect is the minimum architecture of love. Once it collapses, you are no longer renovating. You are standing in ruins. Before he could answer, Matthias joined her, greeting her with familiar ease. Dominic noticed the unspoken alignment between them, intellectual, not romantic, yet undeniably intimate in its respect. As Seraphina turned back to her conversation, Dominic understood something with devastating clarity. She was no longer orbiting him. And the world, which had once reflected his power back at him, suddenly felt far less predictable. The following morning unfolded with a deceptive gentleness, sunlight spreading across Seraphina's apartment in long amber lines that made the quiet feel intentional rather than empty. She had begun waking earlier than necessary, not from anxiety but from an unfamiliar sense of ownership over her hours. There was no one else's calendar dictating the tempo of her day, no urgent corporate dinners to anchor herself around, no last-minute guest lists to refine. Instead, she brewed her coffee slowly, opened the tall windows to let in the cool air, and reviewed the finalized exhibition layout Matthias had approved overnight. The gallery would host critics from 3 continents. Expectations were already rising. Her phone vibrated once across the counter. Theodore Caldwell. The preliminary disclosures arrived, he said without preamble when she answered. Dominic's team is requesting mediation. That suggests concern. Concern about what? She asked calmly. Exposure, Caldwell replied. Financial, reputational, possibly behavioral patterns we have not yet examined. Seraphina absorbed that quietly. She had never sought humiliation for Dominic. She sought structural fairness. Still, the idea that his confidence was beginning to erode did not bring satisfaction, only confirmation that she had assessed the situation correctly. Proceed exactly as planned, she said. Of course, Caldwell answered. Then, after a brief pause, he added, you are conducting this with unusual discipline, Mrs. Hale. Most people fracture before this stage. I fractured years ago, she said softly. I simply stopped pretending I hadn't. After the call ended, she stood by the window for a long moment, recognizing something subtle but profound. She no longer felt watched by the life she had left behind. Across the city, Dominic was discovering that momentum could turn against even the most seasoned architect of success. The municipal contract review had intensified, and although no one explicitly cited his personal life, board members were asking more questions than usual, about continuity plans, executive bandwidth, long-term leadership optics. Cassandra sat opposite him in the conference room, her posture exact as ever. You must stabilize the narrative before others write it for you, she said. There is no narrative, Dominic replied sharply. There is always a narrative, she countered. Silence invites invention. He exhaled slowly. What do you suggest? A controlled announcement, Cassandra said. Mutual separation. Respectful tone. Emphasize Seraphina's independent pursuits. Avoid scandal language entirely. Dominic looked toward the window, jaw tightening. And if she refuses coordination? Cassandra met his gaze evenly. Then you adapt faster than the speculation. For the first time in years, Dominic felt as though he were reacting rather than directing, a position he had always considered professionally dangerous. Later that afternoon, Vivienne stepped into his office carrying a portfolio of media forecasts. She closed the door gently. The markets respond to emotional cues more than facts, she said. If this becomes adversarial, it will echo. He studied her. Are you advising me as a consultant or speaking personally? Vivienne did not flinch. Both realities now intersect whether we acknowledge it or not. Dominic walked toward the desk, resting his hands against its edge. Do you regret the gala? Vivienne held his gaze with characteristic steadiness. Regret is rarely strategic, but I recognize consequences when they arrive. Her answer was neither apologetic nor defensive, simply precise. Dominic realized, not without discomfort, that Vivienne approached life the way a chess player approached the board, every move measured, every risk evaluated. For the first time since the kiss, he wondered whether he had mistaken composure for safety. At the gallery, the installation had begun to transform the vast interior into something immersive and quietly arresting. Steel arcs curved towards suspended glass panels that caught the light like fragments of frozen rain. Seraphina moved among the technicians with confident efficiency, adjusting spatial relationships by inches, recalibrating emotional sightlines. Matthias watched her from a short distance, arms folded. "You navigate space as if you're conducting music," he observed. "Space is emotional," she replied. "People don't realize they're feeling it, but they are." She considered that, then said, "Perhaps I stopped hiding from my own scale." Matthias smiled faintly. "The world tends to reward that." As they reviewed the final hall, he added, almost casually, "There will be collectors attending who fund entire museums on instinct. Tonight is not merely an opening, it is a declaration." Seraphina understood. And for the first time in a very long while, anticipation fluttered somewhere beneath her composure. The evening of the exhibition arrived carrying a quiet electricity. Critics drifted through the halls with attentive expressions, donors lingered near the larger installations, and conversations hummed at an intellectually vibrant pitch. Seraphina wore ivory silk, minimal jewelry, her presence reflecting the same refined restraint as the space she had orchestrated. Julian appeared near the entrance, scanning the room with professional curiosity. "You built an emotional ecosystem," he said after a slow turn through the hall. "I built honesty," she corrected. He studied her carefully. "You are no longer carrying him in your posture." She absorbed that observation more deeply than she expected. "I didn't realize how heavy that had been." Across the room, Matthias introduced her to an influential patron who spoke enthusiastically about commissioning a traveling version of the exhibit. The conversation flowed naturally, anchored in mutual respect rather than social performance. Seraphina felt her confidence expanding not as armor, but as alignment. Midway through the evening, however, a subtle shift rippled through the crowd, the kind caused by a recognizable arrival. Dominic had entered. He had not been invited personally. The event was public within elite circles. Yet seeing him there sent a brief stillness through Seraphina's thoughts. He looked exactly as he always had, composed, tailored, formidable, but something in his gaze searched rather than commanded. Their eyes met across the installation. For a moment neither moved. Then Dominic approached. "I didn't know this was yours," he said quietly, glancing around with unmistakable admiration. "It always was," she replied. He nodded once, absorbing the meaning beneath the words. "You should have never stepped away from this." "I agree," she said. A pause settled between them, not hostile, simply definitive. "You seem happy," he added. "I am no longer negotiating my own worth," she answered. "It creates space for lighter emotions." Dominic lowered his voice. "Do you truly see no version of us ahead?" Seraphina met his gaze without hesitation. "The version of us that deserved a future required two careful people. You stopped being careful." Before he could respond, Matthias approached, greeting Dominic with polite professionalism. The contrast between the two men, one tied to her past, the other witnessing her present, did not go unnoticed by anyone perceptive enough to read emotional geometry. Dominic inclined his head slightly, then stepped away. As he moved through the gallery alone, he recognized something with slow, irreversible clarity. Seraphina had not merely left the marriage. She had expanded beyond the life that once contained her. Weeks later, the legal process entered a sharper phase. Asset divisions progressed with minimal friction. Dominic, despite everything, refused to weaponize finances. Yet reputational tremors were becoming harder to contain. A financial columnist published a speculative piece about leadership distraction within legacy infrastructure firms, carefully unnamed but unmistakably pointed. Cassandra placed the article before him the next morning. "This is how erosion begins," she said. Dominic read it twice, expression unreadable. "Release the statement. Mutual. Respectful." "And Vivian?" Cassandra asked. He hesitated, then said, "Professional distance. Immediately." When Vivian learned of the directive, She accepted it with outward calm, though a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, perhaps calculation, passed briefly through her eyes. "You're choosing preservation," she said. "I'm choosing survival," Dominic replied. For the first time, the air between them felt less like alliance and more like aftermath.